Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Huddlin' with the Pros, Sports Talk Radio. I'm David Weinstein, Huddlin' with the Pros legal analyst. I'm a former state and federal prosecutor, currently practicing criminal defense law here in Miami, Florida with Clark Silverglate. Joining me tonight are my co-hosts, Champ Jordan, and Huddlin' with the Pros sports columnist Bill Gutman. We'll be starting our discussion in just a minute. Tonight we will have our usual update on the Aaron Hernandez trial, and then we will be discussing our hot topic, History's Place in Modern Sports, with our special guest, Kansas City Chiefs historian Bob Moore. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about our show. Huddlin' with the Pros Sports Talk Radio airs live every Wednesday evening from 9 to 10 p.m. Eastern. The goal of our show is to take on all the important and controversial sports issues head on. We'd love to hear from you, so post your questions on our Twitter and Facebook pages at #AskHWTP Sports, or email us at sportstalkradio@Huddlin, HUDDLIN, withthepros.com. We're also on Instagram at HuddlinWThePros. Well, Champ and Bill, there were some surprises in the opening games of the college basketball tournament. March certainly was mad in the beginning. Some early upsets, but when everything shook out at the end, most of the teams who are still in it are teams at the top. There's no real Cinderella out there. Champ, is it what you expected?
You're definitely right. Looking at, the bracket, there were a lot of 14 seeds that, I guess would be the 3 seeds that, was initially surprising, but, when they made it to, the second day, they lost, and it kind of evened out. But I thought it was surprising that Villanova is already out of the tournament, with them being a number 1 seed.
That busted a lot of people's brackets, including my mother's. I'm looking at hers right now. She got wiped out in that conference. But, the lowest-rated seed is UCLA at 11. Bill, does any of that surprise you?
Not really, because as we've said before, almost anything can happen. Usually you do have a Cinderella team, so that's a little bit surprising. I read that the 16 teams left have won 38 championships between them. Of course, UCLA throws that off a little. They've had about, 10 or 11. But you have schools that have been there before. I look at it in a couple of ways. I got to admire a coach like Tom Izzo of Michigan State. He always seems to have his team ready for the tournament. They may have a mediocre first half of the season, and then they start to play better, and somehow when the tournament comes along, they manage to get into that Sweet 16 or beyond that. I did watch some of the Kentucky game, and I haven't seen that much of them. I have a friend of mine who's a terrific sports fan who's 3 years older than I am, so he's been around a long time as well, and he was telling me that Kentucky has maybe the 10 best athletes he's ever seen on a college basketball team at one time, and this and that, and I spoke to him, and I said, they didn't impress me that much the way they played. They were a little sloppy. They certainly have horses that can get offensive rebounds and put the ball in, and he said an interesting thing when I thought about it. He said, you're thinking of the game that we saw and loved back in the 60s and 70s, or even the 50s, and you don't see that game anymore. And, Champ may think a little about this because Champ's more of a modern guy, but you're seeing individual games. You don't see team play that much. You don't see that much of it in the NBA, but you just see individual athletes doing their thing, and they're great athletes, and you get some great games out of it. But there is a difference from years ago, and you can call Kentucky a great team, but the word team to me is just used a little differently than it used to be. They're just 10 great players who could all end up first-round draft choices. So I found that interesting.
Bill, I actually had a question for you. I was wondering, with you talking about Kentucky and, the athletes they have, would you find yourself rooting for them to, go undefeated, or would you be opposed?
I usually, sometimes it's my gut that tells me who to root for, and a lot of times I'll start to root for the underdog, whether I like them before the game or not. I think it's always good to see a team go undefeated. It hasn't happened in, 30-some-odd years. So certainly if they get to that final, I'd probably root for them. But then again, if they're against a Michigan State and a team that's coming up, and I'd probably end up rooting for them more than rooting for the Giants. So it all depends on the situation and what my gut tells me when I'm start to watch the game.
But what if it was Kentucky-Duke?
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know.
Because everyone seems to hate Duke, because I know I do, because I'm a North Carolina fan. So.
Yeah. Well, then I might go for Kentucky to run the table. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to some good games in the next couple of days, taking us into the weekend. But despite the fact that it's off season for the NFL, they seem to have really dominated the other headlines that were going on this week. I think one of the bigger headlines, and something that we've talked a lot about, were some of the changes that the NFL has made to promote player safety. Champ, what do you think of the one rule now where they're going to have an injury spotter standing on the sidelines, and if he sees a situation where he believes a player should be taken out of the game, he's allowed to stop play? What do you think that's going to do to the flow of the game, especially at the end of a half or at the end of the game where one team's trying to race against the clock to get in the end zone?
I think initially you look at it, the NFL they have good intentions, I think, with all the rule changes that they're trying to make. But on the other side, I feel like they're trying to put too many extra things in where it is going to stop the flow of the game, and it might make the games longer, just like, where the issue with, baseball and how, they're trying to shorten the game. It seems like the NFL is trying to do everything in their powers to lengthen the game. And I kind of wonder how that's going to, play with, the TV contracts and, how they're going to play the games. Because, you have a 3-hour slot. That 3-hour slot's going to turn into 3.5 hours. So you just wonder, how that's going to affect the game. But I think it's going to slow the game down.
Bill, what do you think of these other rules that they're putting into place now to make it safer for the players? They seem to be small tweaks on some rules, no peel-back blocks, a receiver that's defenseless gets protection when a pass is intercepted, some more variations on the chop block rule, and they've eliminated some more of the pushing that takes place. You think these are just little tweaks that aren't going to affect the length of the game but are really going to help protect the safety of the athletes?
Yeah, it might affect the length of the game if more penalties are called and more plays are reviewed. But it seems like most of them involved, as you said, blocking and certain types of blocks, maybe to protect knees some more. I think the spotter is there specifically for concussions. I think they said if a player seems disoriented on the field, they would stop play. But the other rule changes, again, seem to be involved with blocking and protecting players from getting blindsided and hit at times when they're not prepared for a hit. So I don't know if that'll slow down the game unless it creates more penalty situations. And, the longer the games, the more the sponsors have a chance to do their commercials. So I don't know how much they'll complain about that.
Well, speaking of sponsors and commercials, one of the other big headlines that came out is that there's not going to be any blackouts in 2015. Whether the stadiums sell out or don't sell out, we're not going to have any blackouts. So do you think that the sponsorship dollars that are going to come in are going to increase now, knowing that all those eyeballs are going to be on television? And connected with that, one of the London games isn't going to be on free TV. You're going to have to stream it. Champ, do you like the direction that's taken us in?
Yeah, I like it because, regardless, people are going to find a way to watch the games. I think, with football being basically the easiest sport to consume because, for the most part, it's just one day a week. You know where to find the games. And it's less games. So I think, people are going to find a way to watch. And I think no matter what, the NFL is going to thrive. So I don't see anything wrong with it. I think it's going to be a positive. People are going to watch.
Bill, what about a guy like you? I know that you've got an iPad, an iPhone, and probably 3 other streaming devices. Are you a little ticked off that you are not going to be able to just turn on the TV on Sunday and watch that Bills-Jaguars game?
Absolutely not. No, I don't sit glued to the TV with every single game that's on. And certainly, if it was a championship game, I might be a little ticked off. But just a regular season game, even if it involved the Giants or the Jets or the Patriots, wouldn't be the end of the world because you do see quite a few games. The blackout rule goes way back, and to me, it was always a strong arm thing with the NFL trying to coerce fans to fill the seats. If you don't go to the games, no one else is going to see them. So, and I remember some blackout game stories from years ago when people used to have to go to motels in a little out of the area where the game was blacked out and everything. But I don't think there's any need for the blackout game anymore because they fill most of the stadiums. People watch. The ratings are sky high, so there really is no need for that. But the streaming thing could be an experiment, and if it works well, you may see more of it. So that's the only thing you might be a little concerned about as a fan.
Well, again, you're listening to Huddlin' with the Pros Sports Talk Radio with me, David Weinstein, Champ Jordan, and Bill Gutman. I want to go ahead and turn to the Aaron Hernandez trial and get our update. We have with us on the phone, calling in, Jenny Wilson from the Hartford Courant. You can follow Jenny at Jenny D. Wilson on Twitter. Jenny, good evening. Thanks for calling in.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me on.
So, Jenny, today there was a lot of action in court that didn't even involve any witnesses. The lawyers for both sides were in there arguing. The prosecution wanted some phone calls to come in that had been recorded while Hernandez was in jail, and they were also arguing about some videos that should be played, both videos from the cameras that were located in Hernandez's house as well as some others. How did each side fare today from what took place?
Well, actually the video motion had to deal with, skipping and sort of freeze framing and the speed at which they were playing some of the tapes. It was a very technical motion, and that one was actually seems to have been resolved by the defense and the prosecution, without the judge having this ruling. The other motion, it was a defense motion, they were trying to block the jailhouse phone calls from coming into evidence at trial. The judge has not yet issued a written ruling on that. She did say that she would admit some of them at trial. So that you can, sort of paint as a loss for the defense, but it's without knowing what she let in and what she didn't, it's difficult to sort of, call it either way at this point, so to speak.
Well, for people who haven't been following the case as closely as you have been and I have been, we're on day, I believe, 33 of actual trial. There have been approximately 115 or so witnesses, and the importance of those calls coming in are not necessarily for the length of the calls or for individualized content, but to show what Hernandez was trying to do with people who were outside of jail to either cover up for what had taken place or to prevent people from testifying. The defense obviously felt that those calls, keeping them out, was important to their case in order to continue to move forward with their theory that this was a sloppy investigation and there's no murder weapon, and the prosecution needed them to tie things together. Who did it appear was really pushing harder on this motion? I know it was a defense motion. Did it seem that the state was pushing a little harder to convince the judge that their position was right, or that the defense had to push harder to convince the judge that these calls shouldn't come in?
I don't think either. I don't think one side was pushing harder than the other. I think the prosecution's argument is that what Hernandez is saying on these calls, what he's doing on these calls is essentially making plans to conceal the crime. The defense has argued that the calls, which, of course, the jailhouse phone calls are recorded. He knows they're recorded, so he never says, I'm going to conceal such and such crime. Not only because that is not exactly how someone would phrase something like that, but also, it's a little unclear from the calls, and the defense is arguing, there's nothing that's said here to indicate that when Tanya says to Ernest Wallace, one of Hernandez's co-defendants, oh, he got me a real nice lawyer, that it means Hernandez paid for her attorney, as prosecution claims. When Hernandez says, don't say nothing on a call to his cousin Tanya, prosecution says, he's telling her not to testify before the grand jury. Defense says, he's just telling her not to discuss private family matters on a recorded jailhouse phone conversation. So they definitely were pushing hard back and forth at each other. Spent a couple of hours today battling over that.
Well, those will all be very important pieces of evidence when they come in, and then it'll come down to how each side argues what they really meant in the closing arguments. But this past week's testimony was actually peppered with a lot of civilian witnesses. There were a few law enforcement and technical witnesses. They were still talking about sneakers and guns, but you got to see a little flavor for some of the cast of characters who were involved here. At the end of last week, they had some people who were testifying about guns that they purchased, that the prosecution said was purchased on behalf of Hernandez, but not by him, and a Camry that was shipped up, as well as some travel plans. How did the jury seem to react to these civilian witnesses who were testifying?
Yeah, we had earlier this week the people talking about guns, and then Hernandez's cousin testifying yesterday. So I think it's probably getting more interesting for the jury from before, when it was just hours and hours of police witness testimony. They're hearing a bit more of a story now.
Speaking of his cousin, that was Jennifer Mercado who testified yesterday. She came in under a grant of immunity, so she had no choice but to testify. But was her testimony really all that believable based on what she was saying and the memory loss that she was having with regard to certain areas?
Yes, well, she definitely did, have trouble remembering a lot when the prosecution was asking her questions about conversations that she had after the slaying, to the point where one of the prosecutors did become visibly frustrated with her while she was on the stand. And he even confronted her later on when, after she was cross-examined by defense, and they started asking her a lot about the drug habits and the criminal records of Hernandez's two co-defendants, Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz, who used to stay at the cousin's house. And the prosecutor said to her, why do you remember all this but you don't remember the other questions? Why are you suffering from lack of memory? Here, when I'm asking you about text messages and phone calls and conversations that you had after Lloyd's killing with your relatives who were charged in the killing, but you remember in perfect detail that Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz, the co-defendants, were smoking PCP on your porch on June 16th, 2013. So she's back on the stand tomorrow, and I'm sure we'll see more of that, those exchanges between her and the prosecutor.
Was it obvious to the jurors that her memory lapses were related to her relationship with Hernandez, or did it appear that her testimony was a little more genuine than the way it was described as well as viewed by people who were able to watch it live?
I have no idea what was obvious to the jurors, or what how they viewed her testimony. I can only say what we observed, what I observed in court.
What was your reaction? Was it obvious that she was covering up, or did it appear she genuinely couldn't remember certain things?
I'm a reporter. I never, ever would comment on someone's motive like that. I only stick to what I observe in court, and that was that she had trouble remembering when the prosecutor asked her certain questions, and that she had, she did seem to have a better time recalling some other details, to the point where the prosecutor pointed it out. So, I can tell you that prosecutors clearly thought that she was being selective in her memory. But I'm not one to comment on whether she was being selective in her memory at all.
Did the pieces to the puzzle, are they starting to connect? Are jurors starting to take more notes, sort of nodding their heads, seeing where everything is going as things begin to get tied up with testimony they were hearing from some of these family witnesses, as well as witnesses who have been given immunity? the importance of the guns that were purchased, funds that were transferred from one bank account to another, travel that was taken by some of the family members, potentially with some of the evidence that was being removed, Hernandez's behavior at the club, and other witnesses were testifying about that. Does it appear that the puzzle is starting to come into shape? The picture is getting a little more clear?
Yes, they're definitely starting to pull all the threads together. Earlier in the case, you would have these vague references to things that didn't really make sense. I mean, it makes sense to people who have been following the case, who have read all the pretrial documents, seen all the prosecution documents, attended the pretrial hearings. But to somebody who's coming into this for the first time, may be a little more difficult. But, now we're getting close to when the prosecution is expected to rest their case, so they are, pulling some of the threads together.
There were a couple of days where the prosecution ran out of witnesses. Did the jurors seem to mind that they were going home early for the day, that it was just going to tack on another day? Was the judge aggravated with the prosecution for running out of witnesses, or did everyone just seem to accept that sometimes that's the way a trial works and you just don't have anybody else to put on the stand?
Yeah, I mean, as far as their sort of public reactions, everyone accepted that, it was the way it was, and there was nothing that, nothing that they could do about it.
From what you can see of Aaron, does he seem to be interacting more or less as the trial proceeds into the last quarter of the evidence that's going on, or is he still sort of sitting at the table, taking it all in, having a minimum interaction with his lawyers?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that he has, minimum interaction with his lawyers, because he is, a lot of friendly greetings in the morning, passing them notes throughout the day, and he has been taking notes consistently throughout the trial, so he really has been pretty engaged throughout the process from what it seems.
Have there been any surprises as a result of some of the rulings, any witnesses who are now coming back into the picture who before people weren't really expecting to hear from?
You mean witnesses that we weren't expecting to testify?
Who would testify? I know there's a laundry list of witnesses out there. Everybody's talked about the fact that Robert Kraft's on the witness list, Bill Belichick's on the witness list, some other football players are on the witness list. Are any inkling as to whether they're actually going to call any of these people? And there was a witness who previously everybody believed, as it related to another incident that Hernandez had been involved in, was not going to testify, and there was some talk today that he might actually take the stand within the next couple of days.
No, there was okay. So you're talking about the Alexander Bradley shooting down in Florida, and he was always expected to testify. The issue, and definitely what I reported all along when they had those motions, was whether or not he would be allowed to testify about a shooting in Florida in February 2013. He says, and he's accused Hernandez in a civil suit of shooting him in the face. He lost one of his eyes, nearly died in the shooting. Criminal charges were not ever filed because Bradley did not tell police who shot him when, he was found back in 2013. He filed a civil suit several months later. So the issue throughout the trial has been that defense lawyers and prosecutors were arguing over was whether Bradley could testify about that shooting. Prosecutors have always planned to put him on the stand, and the judge has ruled all along that they're allowed to put him on the stand to testify about, his former friendship with Hernandez, the fact that he saw Hernandez with a gun in Florida. So you'll get circumstantial stuff like that, but they won't hear about that shooting because the judge and a single justice of the Supreme Judicial Court, the state's highest court, has ruled that too prejudicial.
Well, let's hope that he's able to follow the directions he's given about what he can testify and not testify to. It would be tragic for both sides to come this far and to have a witness like that force a mistrial in this case. Jenny, I want to thank you very much for calling in again this week and giving us that, as we've said, inside the huddle look at what's going on in the courtroom. For everybody out there listening, you can follow Jenny at Jenny D. Wilson on Twitter. And thanks again, Jenny, and we'll speak with you again next week.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Well, Champ and Bill, before we get to our hot topic, I want to remind everybody that they're listening to Huddlin' with the Pros, Sports Talk Radio, with me, David Weinstein, Champ Jordan, and Bill Gutman. I wanted to talk about two quick stories before we went to our hot topic. One was Greg Hardy in the signing of the Dallas Cowboys. There was another public relations twist they tried to put on it as late as today by having Jerry Jones drag his daughter in to put a spin on it. Bill, what did you think of that tactic?
I laughed when I saw that. Leave it to Jerry Jones. I mean, there's been a lot of backlash in Dallas itself, I think more so than other parts of the country. And when he brought his daughter in, and she's referring to this is an opportunity, an incredible opportunity, and she's not afraid of this move. And, of course, she did say it was a horrific alleged assault. And it was just, okay, we're dealing with domestic violence. Let me get my daughter out there to say that this is okay, and it's a teaching moment. I mean, the language just was spin. So, whether you agree that Hardy should be given another chance or not, I mean, just for Jones to trot his daughter out there was almost comical in my mind.
Champ, what's the reaction been in Dallas?
As you know, I'm living out here in Dallas. There's a lot of Dallas fans, so. I guess they're kind of split. I've heard a lot of people who are kind of excited about the deal, just because, basically what he brings to the team and, what they needed. They needed a defensive end who can, rush and get to the quarterback. I think that was one of their, there's something they needed to fix. There's people who aren't looking at it as football. They're looking at it as, what he did, and they're not happy about it. But I think at the end of the day, it's a football. It's a football game. They're more worried about the wins. I don't think they're gonna, worry about what he's done. As long as he serves his time, he got through the court process. So, I think they're gonna just kind of spin it however they possibly can to kind of calm it down and, say the right things.
Well, history has a place, and we'll see if his history repeats itself. But that leads us into our hot topic tonight. History's place in sports. We have a special guest with us this evening, Bob Moore, who is the Kansas City Chiefs historian. Bob is a graduate of St. Francis College in Pennsylvania, and he has more than 30 years of experience as a publicist. He has spent the past 5 years as the team historian for the Kansas City Chiefs, following a 21-year stint as the franchise's director of public relations, where he was the longest-serving public relations director in Chiefs history. During his tenure as the public relations director, Bob was heavily engaged in the development of the Hall of Honor in the Founders Plaza during the renovation of Arrowhead Stadium. And Bob's experience as a founding member of the National Advisory Board of Trustees for the Civil War Preservation Trust was certainly helpful in putting both of those historical memos and monuments in place. As a team's historian, Bob has overseen the care and collection of Chiefs artifacts, many of which are on public display inside Kansas City's Arrowhead Stadium, and he maintains the club's archives and the papers of Lamar Hunt, the founder of the Chiefs and the American Football League. So with that, we'd like to welcome Bob Moore to our show tonight. Good evening, Bob. How are you?
Very good. Thank you very much.
Well, Bob, the first thing I want to ask you is, do all professional football teams have a historian? And if not, do you know how many do?
No, not every team has them. I think at the current count, full-time, there are 4. Myself, Green Bay has one. Miami just got one, and Carolina has one just recently, too. I think the majority of these fellas are like me. They're old PR guys, and that seems to be where all the old PR guys go to die, which is to be historians. But no, not every team has them.
Well, what do you feel is the importance of sports history in today's world, where many young people, all they care about is the present? They really don't, quite frankly, have any idea that the Kansas City Chiefs were originally the Dallas Texans, and they didn't become the Kansas City Chiefs until after the 1962 season. How important is history in today's world?
Well, I think it's important, sports history probably as much as specific teams. I think it's important when, for example, when Lamar Hunt began the American Football League back in 1959, the universe of sports in this country was still pretty much operating at the margins of American culture. And I think it's always interesting that even 5 years before that, Time Incorporated decided to roll out a new weekly magazine for sports, and their board said the only people that would be reading this magazine would be juveniles and ne'er-do-wells, and we all know that magazine now is Sports Illustrated. So when the magazine was launched, they found there was a large and affluent audience of people who wanted to read about sports. So in short, the history of sport as far as a social revolution really didn't come until somewhere, say, late 50s or even into the early 60s. So it's a relatively new thing, even though professional sports and sports in general go back a long distance. So there's a history, and I think it's important that it's maintained. But you are correct. I'd say that the majority of people only go back about 10 years. They even players don't really recall. We have players here that can't believe that Len Dawson ever played for the Chiefs. And what I try to tell them is, well, he didn't look like that when he played for them. But that's just the kind of way players are, I guess. And fans are really the same way.
Well, Bob, we've got with us this evening one of our co-hosts, Bill Gutman, who was probably one of those ne'er-do-wells that Time Magazine was worried about back when they started things off. He's also with us. Bill, I know you've got a couple of questions that you want to ask Bob, so I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Hi, Bob.
Hey.
Yeah, I've been around a while, and I certainly remember all those early Chiefs teams, the one that played in Super Bowl I, and then when they won Super Bowl IV, I remember the players very well. What I surprised at your opening statement when you mentioned that only 4 teams have historians, and only one of those 4, Green Bay, was one of the teams from the original NFL back in the 1920s. So that surprises me a bit. I just think it's very important, because I've always loved history per se, and I think sports history just flows with the history of the country. And to me, it's always been a fascinating subject. I've spoken to a lot of old ball players doing books over the years and just find their stories fascinating. And it's a shame to feel that all that's going to be lost. And one of the things that I want to ask you, do you feel that sports history should be equated also with the history of the times? Because when the NFL began in the 1920s, this was obviously a very different world, and shouldn't that be incorporated somewhat into the history of the sport? Maybe it is at the Hall of Fame, but even with the individual teams that have been around for so long, I think the fans would maybe love it.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think certainly the older fans would love it, because the ones that say have been with this franchise since they came here in 1963, there's still a significant number of people who do follow it. It's important for a couple of other reasons too. Everybody believes that baseball may be America's pastime, but certainly at this point, football is America's game, and there's a couple of specific reasons for that. And these are cultural reasons. I mean, football better suits people's time and what they have the time to watch games and so forth. Baseball, it's a much longer game, and so football better probably fits America's lifestyle now than it did at one time. But there's specific reasons why that happened, and I think people just more or less continue to think that somehow football was always popular. But you got to remember, probably, back in 1959, there were only 12 teams. It wasn't until Lamar Hunt started the American Football League where the game began to grow. I mean, at that particular point, there was an expansion committee in the NFL, and they never had a meeting. And they had to have a unanimous vote by all the owners to expand, and they weren't interested in expanding. So consequently, if the AFL hadn't come along, it would probably have been a lot longer until these teams, began to pop up in other places, not the usual places like New York and Chicago.
Bob, do you think that the AFL gets the credit that it's due for really reformatting the game and making it into what we have now, where there really appears to be no off-season? There's an off-season, they're not playing, but they're always in the news. We're always talking about the game. It's on TV, and really the AFL is what forced the NFL to sign more players, to have a faster-paced game, and put the game on television. Do you think they get enough credit for having done that?
Probably not. I think if you even go to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, the AFL section's not a very large section, and a lot of that's probably due not by intent, but it's just because the NFL had more or less that's where it started. So consequently, I think there's a lot more interest there. And for the longest period of time, there was a certain prejudice about getting players into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. It's the Pro Football Hall of Fame. It's not the National Football League Hall of Fame. So I wouldn't say that I'd say that it's probably been downplayed to some degree, although a lot of the things that have happened, say the two-point conversion, certainly the way the team's uniforms. If you take a look at the early AFL uniforms, they were far more colorful. The game was a little bit more wide open, sort of like the game you'd see today. And the television contract that the AFL signed had a lot to do with what happened with the NFL. For example, the AFL contract for television had all the teams sharing it, and that was later picked up by the NFL. So a lot of the things that took place. The other thing that's important about the AFL was that when the merger finally took place, all the AFL teams came in, and that was an important part in Lamar Hunt's plan. You got to take all of us. You're not going to pick just a couple. So when teams like the Jets got to come in, or the Oakland Raiders, those were teams that the NFL didn't want to come in. So you begin to see AFL teams, all the teams came in. I think that was an important part for the success of the game, because it was spread to more people got to see it, and you got to go play. You got to go watch games in Denver and Houston and Dallas and those sorts of places. Although Dallas did get a team, but only because the Texans were there, and the NFL wanted to shut it off.
Speaking of the Texans, how much of those early years when they were the Texans is incorporated in the history that you would find if you went to Arrowhead and you would go inside some of the collections of the Chiefs artifacts?
More than you'd think. Although you know how cities are today. I mean, even Kansas City, they don't really care about Dallas Texans. But when you work for a man like Lamar Hunt, Lamar was very history conscious, so it's not surprising that we have a lot of items from there. And certainly Lamar didn't want to move. I mean, that wasn't something that he sought, especially that was always an intention to stay there, but it became pretty evident that the city couldn't support two teams, although the Dallas Texans actually outdrew the Cowboys in the first year. So they were the better team when they left. They pulled up stakes and they left. In fact, the Texans facility, they sold it to the Cowboys. So there's a lot of things about the Texans, and a lot of the players, came north. There were most of the players that were with Dallas at that time, the Texans, were Texas players. Lamar saw the value in having Texas players in Dallas because people knew who they were and they would follow them. And so when the team picked up stakes to move, and they were actually drawn to that move because of the mayor here in Kansas City, a lot of the players didn't want to go because Texas was their home. In fact, Lamar at one time even thought about calling the team the Kansas City Texans until some smarter people prevailed upon him and they didn't call him that.
Bob, what do you think?
Bob, I think that.
Go ahead,
I was going to say to Bob, I think there was an arrogance about the NFL because every league before the AFL had failed, including the All-America Football Conference, and then they did what you said. They took in three of the teams, I believe, Cleveland Browns, the Colts, and the 49ers, and then, of course, the Cleveland Browns showed them up by winning the NFL championship the first year they were in the league. But the AFL, I think, did force their hand. They signed the better players. They were signing quarterbacks. The Namath signing made huge news around the country. And then they got the TV contract, and that kind of put them on an equal footing right there.
Yeah, there's no question the TV contract probably had as much to do with it, with the success of the league as anything. And the first one with ABC, and then, of course, the next one, which was done through Sonny Werblin. And Sonny Werblin taking over the New York franchise, as much as anything that happened in the early days, had a lot to do with the league's success because at that particular time, the Titans were in terrible shape. They probably weren't going to make it. But the great thing about the league is they didn't lose any teams, and that was the other thing, and that probably had a lot to do with Lamar, because they would go to these meetings and people would sit around there and say, well, this will be the last meeting, we're not going to be able to make it after this year. But the TV money, and then Werblin being able to get the contract with NBC because of his contacts, and then his ability to sign Joe Namath, it just changed things again. But a lot of the good players coming out of college were also signing with the AFL at that time, and that the TV contract and the war between the two leagues as far as players' talent's concerned, that was the big. It couldn't go on much longer. The league was dying. The NFL was taking it pretty hard at that point.
I want to remind everybody that you're listening to Huddlin' with the Pros Sports Talk Radio with me, David Weinstein, Champ Jordan, and Bill Gutman. We're discussing history and sports with Bob Moore, the Kansas City Chiefs historian. Bill, I guess this is sort of a combination question for both you and for Bob. Bill, as a writer and as a biographer and a sports historian, I know that you've talked to a lot of athletes, and you find it fascinating, or at least I do, when I hear people talk about what takes place. I know that you put an importance to oral histories. Bob, do you share that same importance? And maybe
Absolutely.
You and Bill have the same opinion on that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's real important, and some of the things that take place when you lose a player, you lose a lot. And what's happened, and I'm sure anybody who's written any books about it finds that out. I mean, we just finished about 2 years ago. We were working on a book on Lamar Hunt's involvement in tennis, and Dave Dixon was an important person in that history of the opening of pro tennis, and he died a week before we got to him. So those people are all important, and players especially in the early days. Those are the players that you really need to get a hold of. And we have a lot of tapes and so forth that we work on. And the one thing that the NFL has that probably no other league has, they may have it, but they don't have it to the extent, is the oral history that NFL Films presents. And you'd have to go to the NFL Films offices in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, to really see and understand how much they really have. They have an unbelievable amount of information. And the teams now, because they have large video departments, are doing a better job of talking to the old players, finding out what it was like, and getting their story. So I think at least the NFL is doing a better job than it probably does as good a job as anybody does right now.
Yeah, you'd almost love to have some of those stories recorded and have fans that go either to the stadiums or to the Hall of Fame be able to listen to them, because when I interviewed a lot of older players, some of them are just great storytellers. I mean, they come from a different era and a different time, and they tell a story in their own way, and they tell you anecdotes that wouldn't happen today. All the sports, I remember talking to some old baseball players. They were talking about spring training, and in those days, players didn't come in shape because they didn't work out all winter. They drank beer and went fishing and everything. And Johnny Mize, who was a great power hitter for the Cardinals and Giants, was overweight, and he was wearing a big sweatshirt. And he finally took it off. He was sweating so much and threw it on the ground. And one of the other players snuck up and threw some lighter fluid on it, lit it up, and said, "John, look at that. You drank so much last night, the alcohol caught fire." And Mize believed him. But you hear fantastic stories like that. And for modern fans, I think that would be a great thing if the fans could hear those stories. And, of course, most of those players are gone now. So unless they were recorded and you had that oral history, you lose something.
There's certain players that you can go to. We have a player that was with the franchise here in 1960, Chris Burford, and he was a great player out of Stanford. I go to Chris Burford all the time because he has a remarkable memory. However, I can go to other players. They can't even tell you who's standing next to him in a team photograph. So you have guys that are very, very good, and then you have guys that can't remember anything much about it, and those are the ones. You got to have one or two people from certain eras that are able to remember things. The other thing that's interesting is that players, as much as you may think save things, they don't save very much. So if you're going to be in the historian, you have to start saving these artifacts, or you're going to generally most of the artifacts I get from collectors, I get from children of deceased players, and in some instances, if the history is being made at this particular moment, I get them from, say, some of the people that are there. But players don't save as much as people think in terms of what would consider to be items that you'd see in a museum. It surprises a lot of people, but that's been my experience.
Bob, would you say that's the hardest part of your job, getting those artifacts and collecting things from people who, as you said, just don't seem to like to hang on to them?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, you have to find the right people. And by artifacts, I don't mean the most obvious ones. I don't mean we don't want to have a museum full of 500 jerseys, because a jersey is still a jersey. The other thing you want is you want a jersey that was worn in a game, still has the dirt on it, and there are certain places where you can get those. My favorite thing in the Hall of Honor that we have right now is a game check from a 1961 preseason game. It's $35. And I showed it to a player today, and he's shocked. That can't be true. That must be for his per diem for dinner. I said, no, that's what he was paid. He was paid $35. And it's those kind of things that give the game some makes it different. I have the last helmet worn by a player without a face mask. It was a defensive lineman from the AFL from Boston. He was a defensive lineman. So those kind of items give the game, make the history a little bit more meaningful than just a collection of the same stuff, just the same jerseys or the same helmets. You get a helmet without a face mask and realize that a defensive lineman played without a face mask as late as 1965. It's pretty shocking.
Bob, with the advent of making the game an extravaganza and an experience for fans, we're seeing a lot more interaction at the stadiums with technology, and many of the new stadiums and stadiums that are being refurbished are giving access to technology to fans at their seats and sort of distracting them away from the game. Do you think that a younger generation of fans that's very obsessed with the here and the now and how many yards their fantasy football player is going to get is going to change the way that we look at sports, and that history is going to be lost?
I have mixed feelings about it. I probably don't. What I feel about it probably would be at odds with most people, but there's no question what you say is true. All the stadium interactivities and actual game. I think you have to be careful that your game doesn't turn into a studio sport. It's still going to the game and watching the game from your seat and not watching it from a screen is still the best way, and it makes football special. I mean, we've come a long way. I mean, even in the 50s, even though sports was a vital part of the leisure time of groups of youthful-minded people, you could walk down the street in any major city in America and see no evidence whatsoever of the existence of any spectator sports in this country in the 1950s. And it was the only time you read anything about sports, it was on the few back pages of America's newspapers and maybe a corner newsstand. In other words, it was on the fringes. And the biggest effort people did in sports marketing back then was simply letting people know what time the game was going to be played that day. That was their idea of marketing. Now we go to today, and we're all over the place. I mean, you can virtually now order from your seat your concession, and you can get back to the concession stand and pick it up. You can have it already ordered. You can have already paid for it, and have it waiting for you. Now, maybe that helps you get back to your seat to watch the game. I don't know, but there's no question that if a kid buys a football card, gets a football card today, his interest probably is more what's it worth than I have so-and-so's card. I think it's you got to be careful. I mean, I don't think the league probably believes as I do, but I think there's a little bit more mystery would make it a little bit better.
Bob, there was one place, Bob, where that wasn't true, and that was Brooklyn. In the 1950s, the Brooklyn Dodgers players walked the streets, talked to the fans, went to the same churches, went to the same restaurants, and the relationship between Brooklyn and its players and fans was unique in the history of sports. And again, people don't even remember the Brooklyn Dodgers now. There's a small society in Brooklyn of older people that remember them. It's been since 1958. It's been well over 50 years since they've been in L.A., but there was, and I was told this by players, that there was a unique relationship there between players and fans. So, again, we're talking about history that could be lost, history that shouldn't be lost, and, that's just, again, a fascinating part of sports history.
Yeah, you're not going to find many players living in the city where they play anymore. It's unique here from the standpoint we have a large alumni group called the Ambassadors, one of the early attempts in most NFL cities to have a group of former players who have their careers are over, but they've gone into business and they help younger players who come here. But you don't find that much. So the players that live here, the people like Bobby Bell and the late Buck Buchanan and Willie Lanier, those people who still live in the town that they played in, that's very unique. I mean, you don't see that. I mean, you don't see that. And the problem is that a lot of those players from the early days had to have other jobs. So you might find them in construction. They may live in your own neighborhood. Well, those players aren't going to live in your own neighborhood now. They're making too much money, and their profession is now year round. There's no off time to speak of, not very much. So
and they switch teams too often.
And they switch teams.
Players don't stay. Yeah.
No, I mean the actual attempts of anybody coming to a franchise and staying there is full career, and there are some, but the money's too great, and I think you'll see more of that because I think what teams are doing is they're keeping their great players because they realize that we got to sign these guys early, and so I think it's getting a little bit better. Although you're not going to be able to keep everybody, you're going to have to give somebody up. So that day is gone. The other point I wanted to make about history being important, there's somehow this idea that teams never move, and oh, this is terrible. Such and such a team is leaving its town. Well, if you look back in the history of sports, franchises move all the time, or many of them do. So the idea that a franchise is going to be there forever, it just doesn't happen anymore. So it shouldn't come as a great surprise that there are some franchises that have picked up and left cities and gone somewhere else. If they're going to do it out of New York, then I guess it can happen anywhere. But most people don't think that.
Yeah,
Bob,
and they don't remember the early years either when there were so many different teams that came and went and folded, and the NFL once had a team called the Oorang Indians.
Yep.
They had Jim Thorpe form a team, and they weren't even Indians, and Oorang was the name of a dog kennel. So
yeah, that's the guy who
would
have hatchet fights, I think, at halftime, or they would throw axes. The guy was wrestling a bear, wasn't it? And I think that was
it's
Oorang
great
team.
Old stuff. I mean, it should be remembered. Yeah.
Bob, one thing I want to ask you, and you touched on it a little bit, with the advent of memorabilia and people who are not historians and are not part of the team collecting it simply to make a profit off of it, how much competition do you get from people like that when you're trying to get your hands on a piece of memorabilia for the team's collection versus somebody who's just looking out to make a buck? How much has that impacted your ability to do your job?
I've actually had probably better luck than most because I've dealt with a couple of collectors who are interested in people seeing their collection, and they're certainly not going to see it if it's in their basement. So I have a couple of people who I can go to who are historians by nature. In other words, they're collectors, but they have a affinity for history. So they're happy to share it. So I don't have it. We don't buy anything. We're not going to get into it. There's some things we would buy. I mean, if something popped up that we really, really had to have, we would certainly go out and spend the money to get it. But the good thing is that because of Lamar, he saved just about everything. We have a lot of the early documents. For example, we have his notes on American Airlines stationery, where he set up the rules for the AFL on a flight back from Miami. So those kind of things we're very fortunate to have. And again, I've talked to some of the teams that have come to me and spoken to us about how to collect things. And a lot of them, you got to be careful because they get taken. They end up buying autographed jerseys, which to me really aren't that important. I'd rather have a jersey that I knew. For example, we have Marcus Allen's jersey, dirty, filthy jersey that he scored his 100th rushing touchdown. That's the kind of stuff you want. So it's a mix, I think. But I've been lucky, and you've got to start now. It took us 4 years to get all that stuff. So if you're a team, you've got to realize moments that are important, and you have to recognize that you have to be on top of everything and don't let it get away from you. Because once it's gone, then it's going to be a tough one to get back.
Well, Bob, we all want to thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule and spending some time with us this evening, giving a perspective to history and sports. I know that you not only reminded me of some things that I've forgotten, but taught me a couple of new things that I didn't know along the way, and we really appreciate what you're doing both for the Chiefs and for the National Football League and for sports fans all over to keep our sense of history in perspective. Is there anything coming up in the coming season other than a quest like everybody has to make it to the Super Bowl that's going to be special for the Chiefs this year that you want to plug?
Well, I think that we have a new exhibit going in the Union Station here called Gridiron Glory, which is a gigantic collection of stuff from the Pro Football Hall of Fame as well as some items from us. So that's our large thing. We're going to have it all summer. So that'll be pretty much of a major attraction here in Kansas City down at the historic Union Station. So if people get into town here somewhere between May and Labor Day, they'll have an opportunity to go there and see that. And it not only will cover historical moments with the Chiefs, but it will also include a lot of the old ex-Chiefs players like Bobby Bell and some of the new players like Will Shields, who's going into the Hall of Fame, and they'll be available there to talk and see things as well. So, that's probably one of our largest things that's taking place this summer. But appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, gentlemen, and your interest in history of sports is much appreciated.
Thank you, Bob. And Bill and Champ, that give us an excuse to take a ride into Kansas City for something more than just a little bit of barbecue.
Hey, you're always welcome. Just let me know.
All right.
I
thank
can
you,
watch
Bob.
the Royals play.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, fellas. Thanks again. Take care.
Take care. Well, real quick, Bill and Champ, before we close up for the evening, you've got to be salivating, Bill. Spring training is almost up here, and it's going to be real baseball time soon. Anything out there happening that is really making you wonder what's going to be coming up this season?
Well, you've had two pretty major pitchers go down already, and having Tommy John surgery. Yu Darvish of the Texas Rangers, and now young Zach Wheeler of the Mets. Both of them have come in and had elbow issues immediately. Cliff Lee is shut down for 60 days with a tendon issue in his elbow. His career may be over. He doesn't want to have surgery. So, the Tommy John thing continues to be a major problem for baseball and a major epidemic in baseball. I don't know if they're ever going to be able to cure it now, but that's a big story. And now the teams just are sorting out their rosters now, and they're getting the players in shape. And, of course, injuries will play a big part. And, it's hard to say with so many teams making the playoffs, you really can't pick someone. I think it's interesting that the Dodgers just spent $62 million to sign another Cuban player, a 29-year-old named Hector Oliveira, and they don't even know where they're going to play him. And there's a rumor, even though he's an infielder, that he has an elbow issue and may require Tommy John surgery. So it doesn't only happen to pitchers, but the Dodgers are spending big. They now have the biggest payroll in baseball, larger than the Yankees. So whether they'll be successful in the next year or so and win a championship will be an interesting thing to watch.
All right. Well, Champ and Bill, another great show. Champ, I know that we're looking forward to the Elite Eight, setting up that Kentucky-Duke game so we can see who Bill's really going to root for.
But, yeah, can't wait.
As a reminder, Huddling with the Pros, Sports Talk Radio, airs live every Wednesday evening from 9 to 10 p.m. Eastern. The show is produced by Jacqueline Park and is a Hyacinth Communications production. Be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Special thanks to our guest Jenny Wilson, who you can follow at Jenny D. Wilson on Twitter, and to Kansas City Chiefs historian Bob Moore, as well as our great Huddling with the Pros team, Champ Jordan, Bill Gutman, Danita DePool, and our digital editor, Thomas Zoe. Good night, everyone, and we'll see you next week.